Welcome to the Create What You Speak podcast. Join me as we have a real-life discussion on how to change your life by changing your thoughts. Remember, question everything, trust yourself, and find your truth. Welcome to the Create What You Speak podcast. My name is Sloan Fremont, and I'm your host. This is a show where we talk about how to free our minds from the mainstream or matrix level programming that we've all been taught to believe. This is through society, through government, through our, quote, school systems or indoctrination systems, however you want to look at that, Hollywood, big tech, and the list goes on. But programming isn't just what's imprinted on us by the matrix also. It's also freeing our mind from our own programming, those negative thought patterns, those loops, those things that we say to ourselves that keep us stuck in these places that we don't want to be. And this week, our topic is two parts. We're going to talk about using skepticism, discernment, and alternative thinking to free our minds so that we're able to actually think freely. And then we're going to shift gears and talk about the monetary system and how we can really start to look at things through a different lens when it comes to protecting ourselves financially. And so today I'll ask you to keep an open mind with this show and what we're going to talk about. And joining me today is Lawrence Rook, and he's the author of the book, Your Money, Your Mind, How Open Skeptical Thinking Improves Your Life and can protect you from the pandemic wealth transfer. Lawrence has been a researcher of alternative information for many years, particularly in the field of health and well-being, and more recently, the worldwide financial system. He's a professional chirologist, which, Lawrence, I hope you tell us a little bit about what that is, because I'm interested to hear about that. And he has a background in healthcare with a degree in Chinese medicine. Lawrence lives in Devon, England, with his wife and two young children, studying for a doctorate in counseling, psychology, and psychotherapy. And just as a reminder, we will be touching on financial topics today, and this is not financial advice, so please do your own research. So, Lawrence, welcome to the show. I'm so glad you're here.
Thank you for having me, Sloan. Yeah.
So let's start out. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what the catalyst was for writing your book?
Absolutely. So I've always been quite questioning, and I consider myself quite alternative and quite spiritual. And I've always kind of hung around with these types of people, and my profession as a chirologist is very alternative. A chirologist is somebody who studies people's hands. So I look at people's hands in relation to psychology, personality, and health. Mm-hmm. And in doing this, I've always had a very open mind. And what I found is that when starting to question the COVID narrative, so much of it could be explained through finances. And then I started to look at what was going on financially, and so few alternative thinkers, I believe, are aware of what's going on in the financial system and how they can sidestep it. So lots of alternative people, I think, are aware of mainstream media, and they are aware of the dangers of that. So therefore they get their information elsewhere. They're aware of their health, so they don't eat GMO foods, they go and buy organic. But I think comparatively, not many alternative thinkers know how the financial system is actually intrinsically set up against them and what they can do about it, and how they can then empower themselves and be much more independent and sovereign and free once they understand this information.
Yes, and that's so key. The word you said, sovereign and free, and those are two things we talk about a lot on this show, and being able to really, because these topics, first, we're not taught these in the schools, indoctrination centers, as I call them. We're not taught this, right? They don't want us to understand how this works, because if we understood how it works, we wouldn't participate in it. We'd be doing something completely different. So it's not that we were taught this and we just can't learn it. It's that we just don't know. And for years, this kind of topic was considered conspiracy, right? You were, all kinds of things were said about people who questioned the way things were set up. But now after 2020, I think people's minds are more open. And as we were talking about before the show, I hid my spiritual side before 2020. My background was in IT. I was very logical thinking, right? And that's how people knew me. People didn't know my spiritual side. But as everything happened in 2020 and has gone on, and here we are in 2022, we see that people are crossing over. Those two topics are crossing over. So it's not uncommon for a spiritual person to talk about the financial side of things, but then also still stay on that spiritual track, because for some reason, prior prior to that, it seems like those two things were separate. Like we had this belief that they couldn't come together. But what I loved about your book is bringing those two elements together in a way that we can apply in our own lives. We can take what was written and really start to apply that in our own lives and merge these two things together. So they're not these separate things thinking we can only be one or the other or have one or the other.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And there's a lot to unpack there. And I think as awareness increases, for me, that's the definition of spirituality. Yeah. I think you can think about it, ultimately, we are just consciousness, and that's taking it from the highest possible plane. Right. And so I think any process in which people are expanding their awareness, questioning more, and exposing themselves to more information, for me, that's an inherently spiritual process, because they're expanding their mind. And as you expand, you gain more awareness. And the quest for spirituality is to increase awareness. Right. So I think it's amazing that since 2020, as you say, there are just so many people now who are questioning more of the mainstream narrative, questioning more of the authority figures, and as a result, looking much deeper into themselves and questioning who they are. What are they doing? Why are they in this job? Why are they conforming to this? Why did they used to believe that? Why don't they believe it anymore? And it's a self-discovery process. It's a process of like a therapeutic journey. Yeah.
And I felt like for me during this whole time, like the spell has been removed, right? We all lived under this quote spell for most of our lives where we just did what we were told. And then we didn't stop to ask questions. And now we are stopping to ask the questions. We had the time, right? We didn't have a lot to do in 2020. So we started asking a lot of questions. And you open your book talking about having an open and skeptical mind. And what I loved about your book was that you covered such big topics, but you did it so succinctly that it was very easy to understand, but then also someone could take any element of the book and go research, dig deeper and get more. But you give people enough information that at a high level, it could be explained back to someone else very easily. And I think that you did such a great job with such complex topics. So I love that. I love that about the book. So when in the opening of the book, you talk about the skeptical mind, and you talk about how truth is layered and best thought of in terms of levels or degrees, which I really loved how you put that, because I think most of us always thought what we thought was true. Like this is true, right? Whatever it is, whatever the topic is. And when we started to unpack some of these things and see, wait a minute, what I thought was true wasn't. And now I don't know what I believe anymore. And it's a little unnerving. It's, we go through this whole process of almost like a grief process, like a death of what we thought we knew. And now we're having to look at the world differently. So let's talk about that a little bit, and what that was like for you, and how you really see about how we can open our mind and really start this process of expanding our thinking. I know there's a lot there, so we can.
But it's all important stuff. So what I think about it is that most people, whether they realize it or not, don't actually pursue truth. And this is something I talk about in the book. Right. And to pursue truth can be very challenging, very painful, very distressing, and very hurtful, which is why intrinsically people can sometimes reject it. Right. But I would say that ultimately, for one's spiritual growth, pursuing truth is always going to lead to something greater. And the more we can pursue truth, the more open naturally we're going to be to different types of information, because we don't have an agenda. Right. So if somebody says, go watch this video, go read this report or whatever, if you're pursuing truth, you'll have no biases to not read it. It means that the information you expose yourself to will be greater. And this is generally the difference between people with an alternative mind, or let's just call it a mainstream mindset, just for argument's sake. And people with an alternative mindset have a far wider range of information that they're willing to expose themselves to. Right. And discerning truth is very hard. So, that's why I discuss it in terms of different layers, and you can always find more and deeper truths. But ultimately, I think what we can all do is open up ourselves to the widest range of information as possible. And in doing that, we're going to have a much, much better chance of finding truth.
Right. And I know in my experience, when, like you were saying, when you're willing to have an open mind, you're not trying to fight and prove your side of the story is right. You're not trying to hold on to something that you're trying to prove. When you have an open mind and you can explore anything out there, you having the willingness to do that, to change your mind. Because a lot of times, I know for myself, I felt like if I changed my mind about something, like I had done something wrong, or it was like bad to change your mind, right? But that is the part of the process, is we continue to learn, and we grow. And when we're willing to open our mind, we get to see things in a different way. And I talk a lot about on the show about stories, right? We have these stories in our that we tell ourselves. I mean, our whole life is a story, right? Whatever we're telling ourselves in our mind, that's what we're experiencing. And you mentioned in the book how our lives are driven by narratives, and that, as you mentioned, when we start to even question our own stories, like I said at the beginning of the show, it is unnerving, and it can be so scary, and it can be so disorienting, or we want to fight against it. But if you can continue to slowly, it's almost incrementally, right? Like opening the crack just a little bit at a time, there is so much freedom on the other side of that cannot be experienced when you're locked tight in your story, whatever that might be.
100%, and that is the breaking out of the matrix. You mentioned it at the start of the show, and it's or the Plato's cave analogy.
Right.
When you step out and you see the light, and it's that process of expansion. You're expanding your awareness and seeing more and perceiving more than what you did, and that is the unraveling of truth. You're seeing more truths, and you're seeing more and more and more about what really happened, about what really happened in your past, about what your job is really like, about what your motivations for making money are, about the relationship you have with your partner, and you're constantly kind of growing and expanding. And the reason I say an open and skeptical mind is because I think both of those components are really important. Yeah. So you outlined the open side, which is extremely important. You always need to be questioning more and trying to receive more information. And then the skeptical side is you always want to be checking your assumptions.
Right.
You never want to just be thinking, oh yes, I know that because there's a feeling about it, whatever. You need
or
to be
someone so
going
told
back
me
and being like, exactly. And you need to be tracing it back one step further, and then one step further, and then one step further. And then what so often happens is that when people actually chase back their assumptions, they find that they're held on a very flimsy belief system.
Right.
And then all of a sudden they start to question that very belief system, and then that's
the
another
unraveling begins.
Awakening. Exactly. Yeah. So always be incredibly skeptical of information. I'm extremely skeptical, but in doing that, then leads me on enormous tangents into areas in which other people, might not explore.
Yeah, and one thing I have trouble with when I think about, when I go down rabbit holes, let's say about different topics, sometimes I come to an ending where I'm like, I don't know what I believe anymore, and I feel like I can't believe in anything. How do you handle those kinds of situations?
It's tricky, and this is a conundrum of many, many great philosophers over the age, and I think it comes down to a sense of, for me, it comes down to a sense of knowing that there is something greater and having more of a spiritual perception of things. I do believe that we are all consciousness, and that consciousness is collective, and we're just part of that same unified conscious field that's having a unique experience. And I think there's really good scientific evidence to actually back that up. So that would be for me personally, but people do need to have values, and they do need to have things that orientate them. But the problem is if the things that they value the highest are built on wobbly foundations, let's say, that's when the crisis can happen, when they confront truth. Right. So to give an example, if somebody's in the army and their highest value is to become a sergeant major, and they kind of worship that status, right, and they associate themselves with being in the army, all their friends are in the army, their identity is being a soldier. Yes. So then what happens when they find out that their sergeant, who they've been following their whole life, got admiration they find out that person is corrupt, or they find out that the army is doing something intrinsically wrong and some experiment somewhere, then they've got a choice. They can either switch off from that information and carry on and pretend they never saw it, or they have to change their life. And changing their life is very difficult, but that is the spiritual journey.
Yes. And so many of us went through that and are still going through that. And I did a show back in 2020 called The Era of the Guru is Over, because I felt like we were finally at a stage where we were realizing that the answers are not outside of us. The answers are within. We've been taught they're not, but that's not true. That's just, again, part of that matrix programming. And so going in and trusting ourselves brings up a whole other level of learning, starting from a beginner stage of really understanding what it means to trust yourself and that you have the answers. And when we're faced with these things, like the example you just gave, where what we thought we built our foundation on becomes, we find out the truth of that, right? Then it can feel again like I did something wrong, or I'm bad, or we can ignore it or whatever. But the part of the journey, like as you mentioned, the whole part of it is expansion, I believe. Like we came here for expansion, right? We didn't come to stay in the box and have these experiences that were only hitting up the edges of the box, right? The box is meant to grow. And so as painful as everything has been, that's one of the best parts of the past 2 years of pushing up on that box and expanding the box and being able to get out of my own head in my own way to live my life in such a authentic and different way than I was living it before.
Completely. And it goes back to what you were saying, that once you start to break out, to see the truth, to expand, there's such a feeling of liberation that comes with it. It's kind of like if somebody was stuck in a bad relationship and it's an abusive relationship and they know they should leave, but the hard part of ending a relationship is always the decision before. It's working out in your head, look, I need to leave. But as soon as you say it's over, that's when the liberation comes. Right. And that's when all of the potential and all of the new possibility then arises. And what it actually is that I think is going on, worldwide, is people are essentially just letting go of an identity, letting go of an ego. If I go back to the example of the person in the army, in order for them to accept what the truth is, they're seeing the corruption in the army, they're seeing the corruption in their heroes in the army, they have to let go of their identity. They are no longer who they thought they were. They can't be the soldier. And that's the same as anybody. Someone in the medical establishment, if they see corruption in big pharma, they can't hold their identity as a doctor anymore. They have to let it go because they realize it's corrupt. And as more and more of these systems are exposed, people are becoming freer and freer and freer. But it's a painful process for some people as they have to let go past identity.
Yes, that's exactly right. And I love the way you describe that, because that is so true. And you can look at that letting go two ways. You can look at it as the fear side of it, or you can look at it as the opportunity that comes with that, right? Because deep down, most of us knew in some way it wasn't quite right, but we couldn't really probably put it into words. Some maybe could better than others, depending on maybe what industry you were in. But to me, being able to let go of all this, all these expectations and all this fakeness that we lived for so many years is very, very freeing.
Completely liberating. That's exactly it. And then the irony with this is that the people who are most successful in any system, they have the most to lose.
Right.
The people who are at the top of any profession or near the top, who make the most money, who have the most esteem, who have the most recognition, their identity is much, much stronger. So therefore, finding it very hard to question that system, because then they've got so much to lose if they question it.
Exactly.
Which is kind of like it's a vice, it's a mental vice. So that's why I think we need to be very careful following experts. And we need to be very trusting authority, because really those authority figures have got the most vested interest in whatever it is that they're professing.
When I read that in your book, the light bulb went off for me, because again, it was so simply explained and it made so much sense. Because as we've seen over the past 2 years, authority, who we maybe would have looked to as authority in the past, as we've all seen, that isn't exactly what is true. And then it leads us to, okay, so what is truth, right? Because then there's different degrees of truth, I suppose, different levels, there's all of these things. But thinking about it in that way, that a person who is a quote expert, which I don't even like that term because it's, I don't like it personally, but an expert has such a is so tightly wound in the box, right? The box is conforming to their skin, right? They are the box. But when we're talking about open and skeptical thinking, like people who are more aware or more open to this, our box is as big as we want it to be. And that is, but in society, the person who is the quote expert wearing the box, they've been raised on the pedestal, where those of us who had the opener, more skeptical thinking, we were looked down upon and called names and, conspiracy theorists and all this stuff. But the paradigm there, I think, is finally shifting, where people are starting to see, wait a minute, no, just because somebody stands up on the stage and tells me something on TV, I mean, surely I know all the listeners listening know that no, we don't get our news from quote TV, but there's such a shift there that honestly, I never thought we would ever see. And it's amazing that it's finally starting to go that way.
It's inspiring, isn't it? It really is. And there are two ways that you can look at, the world and events going on. And, one of them is that it's absolutely tragic and there's so much deceit and corruption and everything, but things have to get bad for people to realize it, don't they? And it's coming to the surface. It's getting so strong that people can't ignore it. And there are people that ignore it, and there will be people that will always stay blind to it, in the same way that there are people that will always stay blind to, any cult, and they can't break free of it. But I mean, a lot of what happens in our psychology as a society is we give away our power. And we give away our power through, outsourcing our respect to other people. We outsource our information to the media. We trust the scientists blindly. And we also think that we are not smart enough to evaluate the science. We think that we are not capable to kind of view things logically, but we absolutely are. And this is all part of the hierarchy. The people who are at the top in whatever profession, they want to protect their status, and they do so by making us feel we're dumbed down in some kind of way.
Yeah. And then you think about the way it is in, schools growing up, right? You're taught to fit in, get in line and stay in line. Otherwise you're a problem. And then there's other things that are done when that happens. But being if everyone would understand that this is all, we came into this world with intuition, with emotions, with feelings, and we've ignored those for so long. And we've told ourselves not to listen to our intuition, or that our feelings don't matter. And that is absolutely not true, right? These are all ways that we're guided. These were gifts we were given to guide ourselves. And so I am also glad to see that is being more, it's something that I think it was talked about before, but it's like a whole nother level to that now, where people are actually like, understand. It's almost like you can't not do it now. Maybe, I don't know if that makes sense, but everything that we've went through, there has to be a different, like we have to do things differently, and being able to utilize those gifts that we were given and see that it's okay to do that. I think that's a shift I've seen with people I've talked to, and just, family, friends, that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's an amazing shift, amazing and empowering, because as the old systems crumble, be it education, media, healthcare, whatever it is, people then have to start taking responsibility for themselves, and people have to start manifesting what it is that they want in their life. And if things are locked down, then people get creative and they start creating. And I think there's a lot of real positive things that can come. Yeah.
Like what you hear so far? Take what you've learned and invest in yourself with the Create What You Speak Academy. Visit createwhatyouspeak.com to learn more. Now back to the show. So let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the monetary system. So the second part of your book focuses on that. And again, I think, as I said earlier, what I loved is how succinctly you described some of these very, very complex and very, these are like mind-blowing concepts to learn, I think, because again, we're not taught this. And when people really understand at a basic level how things are set up and stacked against us, again, you go through this whole range of emotions, right? From anger to disbelief to, whatever it might be. But can you, and I don't know if you can, so we might have to take this in layers, but can you briefly describe our current monetary situation? And if you need to narrow it down, or if there's a better way to ask this, feel free to describe it in that way.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So yeah, this is it. And the same happened for me. So I've been completely on your wavelength in terms of, how I'm thinking and stuff, and questioning things and being open-minded, being spiritually inclined, etc. But I'd never looked at the monetary system in detail, because I think a lot of nice people who work with others, or are either very creative or therapeutically minded, they see money as being a bit of a, nice people don't work for money. And right. Money in our society and the way the world is structured, money relates to freedom.
Right.
Because if you have a lot of money, you have more options, and that's freedom.
Right.
People who have little money, they're trapped, and that's a terrible thing. So money in our society is really this mechanism of control. So in order to be truly free, to be truly liberated in this society that we live in that's governed by money, you need to understand how money works, what it is.
Right.
So in short, our money that we have is called fiat money. Fiat means by decree. And what it means is that it's intrinsically not valuable. A piece of paper that we use for money, there's no actual worth to that. You can't take it to the bank and get any gold for it. It's not backed by anything. So it's just issued by government, and we have to trade with it. Now, the big issue is that the government control the money system.
Right.
So they get to print more money whenever they want it, and they get to give it to whoever they want. And this is called inflation. Now, the analogy I use for this is, the analogy for this is to think about playing Monopoly. Now, if you've got 3 or 4 people playing Monopoly, but one of them is the banker, and they've got as much money from the bank as they want, and they can give it to another player whenever they want, what's going to happen to that Monopoly game? It's going to be incredibly one-sided. And very soon, the person with access to the money is going to mop up all of the properties.
Right.
And this is very literal to what we're seeing now. What's happening since COVID, but this has been happening longer, but since COVID, it's got to an extraordinary level. There's been a huge amount of stimulus and money printing. And that money printing has gone to private banks, it's gone to hedge funds, it's gone to big corporations, and they are buying up all of the valuable property and goods in society. And what this does is it makes the rich incredibly rich, and it makes the poor and middle class incredibly poor. Because if someone doesn't have a house, well, inflation means that house prices have just gone up 20%.
Right.
So where are they going to get that extra 20% from?
Right.
And if somebody's on minimum wage, well, Thanksgiving dinner went up 20% in America last year. Well, where are they getting that extra 20% from?
Right. Because they're not making it up in the wages, right? You're not getting a 20% raise to, offset that.
This is exactly it. So the way you think about that is if you have $10,000 in the bank, and let's say inflation in the US is officially 7%, but it's actually much higher than that. So say inflation is 10%. If you have $10,000 in the bank, 10% inflation means that the purchasing power of your money has just gone down 10%, which means that now effectively you've got $9,000.
Right.
And
you did nothing, right? You did nothing.
And you did nothing. This is it. So this is why over time, people are having to work harder and harder and harder to get a down payment for a house. And this is why over time, people are having to work harder and harder and harder to pay for a whole house. And if you think about how many people can survive, how many families can survive on a single income now compared to what they would have done 60 years ago. Nowadays, both parents have to work pretty much full time in order to support a family. This never was the case. And this is all down to the fact that our money is being devalued. And that's the way to conceptualize it. Over time, our money is worth less and less and less and less. $10 in 1910 would have bought you a hell of a lot more than $10 in 2020.
Right.
And as we carry on printing more and more money is becoming less and less and less valuable. So the question is, how do we protect ourselves from this?
Right.
When they're taking our money away from us, which is our time, our money is our livelihood, it's our freedom. Our freedom is being taken from us. Our time is being taken from us.
Mm-hmm.
And in the bank, it's getting taken from us. If we put it under the mattress, it's getting taken from us. And this is the conundrum.
Right. And, then you get mad and depressed and, feel like, what's the point, and all of these different emotions, right, that come through, because a lot of these, we're talking about things that are so big, right? The matrix is not like just the corner store, what I mean? It's everywhere, and it's everywhere around us. And so knowing what we know about the financial system, how can we protect ourselves, and I like in your book, you talk about two ways, digital and analog. So maybe we can think about it from those ways. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, definitely. So we're in a very technologically driven age, aren't we? And everything's going online, everything's being digitized. And if you think about the world, music has been totally digitized. Mm-hmm. Spotify is huge now. People don't have CDs. Yeah. Right. Books are all online now. Actual physical bookshops, are getting less and less, and there's more PDFs and things. Movies, people don't buy DVDs anymore, do they? Right. Everyone watches on Netflix. So everything's being digitized. And what I give as a digital option for storing wealth is Bitcoin. Mm-hmm. And not everybody is going to resonate with this, just because it requires a certain amount of perhaps technological understanding. But Bitcoin is something that's outside of the traditional financial system, which means it's not owned by bankers. It's not owned by government. So it's decentralized, which means nobody owns it. Right. And there's a finite amount. There's only ever going to be 21 million, which means it can't be printed. Right. So when we think about what the problem is central bankers in every country in the world are printing money, and they control the money. So we need to find something that they can't print. Right. So the digital version of that would be Bitcoin. And you can look at other cryptos as well. But in the book, I explain why Bitcoin is essentially the best solution for that. And then if you go to analog, which is tangible, physical, then I say gold and silver, which have been money for thousands and thousands of years. And universally, gold is a store of value. Universally, people will accept silver as wealth. And there have been lots of monetary collapses throughout history. And there have been some ones that have happened very recently. There's a monetary crisis going on right now in Turkey. Argentina's currency is really struggling. And people in these countries have lost all of their wealth because the currency goes to zero or near zero. So you can have $100,000 in the bank, but if the currency then goes into hyperinflation or they print too much money, no one wants the dollars. Right. So you can't buy anything with it. Right. And if we get to that situation, what I suggest and advise to everyone really is to think about is, what would you rather be holding? Would you rather be holding dollars that are being printed by a central bank, or would you rather be holding a piece of gold that no one can print and has been money for thousands of years? And exactly the same with silver. So anything that's a hard asset, anything that's real, tangible, and has got value kind of intrinsically. Yeah. And so let's take the digital piece. Let's take Bitcoin first, because I know some of the listeners maybe already own Bitcoin. I own Bitcoin. Maybe some are never own that. That's not for me, which that's fine too. And there's some that might be in the middle, right? Maybe still exploring, still trying to understand this. And this is why I suggested at the beginning of the show to keep an open mind. And as we've talked about, being skeptical and, looking at both sides of it. But when you really dig in, and Lawrence's book does a great intro of how, in more detail of how all this works. When you really start to see that
the whole system is stacked against us financially, right? And then there's this whole other piece with debt and, how that all works and why debt is needed and how you basically create money out of nothing. And then it just keeps, recycling in the fractional reserve banking and all of this stuff that happens, which we're not going to get in on this episode. But there's so many elements to that. When you start to see that, something should probably go off in your mind, like, okay, wait a minute, then what I've been doing, because then it can become like this panic, right? Of, oh my God, then what do I need to do? Cash in my savings and put it all into Bitcoin or buy all this gold and silver, right? And so, and again, we're not talking financial advice here. We're just talking as we see it. But there's something to be said for understanding each element of this and doing what's right for you to protect yourself in whatever way you feel makes the most sense, given what you know.
Yeah, this is exactly it. And to zoom out a second, it's the same crisis that people experience in any revealing.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
let's take the JFK one, for example. Somebody who would never believe that the CIA might be involved in assassinating a president might be horrified when they watch, footage or a documentary, or they do some research into it. And their first thing is horror. They're hit with sadness, then they're angry. And then finally, they find the bigger picture. They see where it fits into place. They zoom out. They understand how this matrix is working. And that's where the acceptance comes. Right. And they probably won't want to go and work in the CIA as a result. So, that's how they can then start to take good action in their life.
Right.
And it's exactly the same with this monetary system. And there are so many penny drop moments for me when researching it. And it takes a long time to assimilate, and it takes a long time to process, because it's having to rewire the way your brain thinks, rewire the way you see the world, and rewire your value system, because we value things in money. I'm looking at my computer now, and I look at that in relation to money. I look at it and I think £500, and someone else might look at their car and think of it as $5,000. But when you realize, hang on a minute, what does that actually mean? They're just printing that. Is there any value in dollars over time? So there's all of these kind of rewiring moments that have to happen. But as with anything else, the more someone digs into it, the more they let the information assimilate, the more they're able to accept it and then start to benefit from it. Because once you accept a difficult truth, that's when you are now in control. Because you now choose, do I continue saving in fiat currency, or do I start taking some of my savings and start putting them into tangible hard assets? And that's when the power comes.
Yeah. Because you're breaking out of that. You're breaking out of that matrix, essentially. So let's talk a little bit about maybe some of the cons of digital and analog, because as you said at the beginning, right, we want to have a skeptical mind. We want to look at both sides. So what's some of the cons for digital and analog assets?
Yeah. So gold has been money for the longest period of time. And currently in our world, we've actually got central banks all over the place who are accumulating gold. And this is very telling. Right. The Russian central bank is getting rid of dollars and it's accumulating gold. China are accumulating lots and lots of gold. But the system doesn't tell you that gold is valuable. The monetary system tells you that gold is actually archaic. We don't need it anymore. Modern societies can't function with gold. Yet all the big players are actually accumulating it. Now, the challenge with gold is that it's a bit cumbersome. It's actually quite hard to store. If somebody's very wealthy and they've got £1 million or $1 million, to put that all into gold and keep it safe is quite difficult. It's also quite difficult to move. So if you wanted to leave America and go to a different country, you wanted to go to Mexico, or you wanted to go to Europe, taking £1 million worth of gold would be dollars worth of gold would be very difficult to do. There'd be huge fees, and people would stop you.
And you could get robbed and all these other things, right?
Totally.
Keeping it at home, right? You'd have to worry about that.
Yeah. And the government historically actually has put a ban on gold and has seized gold, and almost every society has got a history of banning or seizing gold in some kind of way. So that would be one of the limitations, really, and the primary limitation of gold. Silver, I make a case for silver in the book, because if people have their money in gold, and they transfer everything into gold, if there is a big economic collapse and there is a great reset, like has been spoken about,
right,
gold isn't going to be able to be traded in markets. A gold coin is going to be too valuable. Gold will be worth buying a street of houses. So that's where silver comes in. And in places where hyperinflation and currencies have collapsed, like in Greece and Cyprus, silver has been used to barter, and people who had silver coins were fine. They were able to trade everything. So that's why I think silver is really valuable. The downside, though, as I said, is confiscation, in infringement in some kind of way. They could put huge taxes on gold, meaning people can't really trade in it, and they can try and ban it and buy people from banning it. This is where digital protection comes in, and this is where Bitcoin is extremely compelling, because in Bitcoin, you have it on a little, let's say, a USB stick, and you can send it anywhere in the world in an instant. Nobody can stop you sending that Bitcoin. And you can send $1 million worth of Bitcoin around the world in 5 minutes, and it's there. And you can hop on a plane and go anywhere with your Bitcoin and go to, Africa, and suddenly be able to access it from the internet. So it's borderless. And this is the real innovation. The other thing is, as well, is that in the most extreme scenario, it would be much, much harder to take someone's Bitcoin than it would be their gold or their silver, because you'll be having to crack a code from their head, which is very, very hard to do. You can never really confiscate Bitcoin. The only way you can take it down or confiscate it is if you somehow shut off the whole internet, and maybe that might happen, who knows. But when it comes back on, then the Bitcoin will still be there. There are pros and cons, obviously, with both. Bitcoin, it's only 10 years old. It's not tried and tested. There's a very mysterious origins to it. And some people might speculate and argue that it could be some kind of Trojan horse. And it's kind of like, some kind of nefarious entity has given this thing called Bitcoin, and it might be a trap down the line.
I've thought that, yes.
Yeah, this is it. And I mention a couple of reasons for that in the book. And it's all about risk assessment, really. There's a risk with everything, and we've got to work out in ourselves with our own research where we feel comfortable, because there's a big risk for me with having money left in the bank, because what we saw in Cyprus, which was in Europe about 10 years ago, was that the banks were all closed, and anybody with over 100,000 euros saw the rest of it taken by the bank. This is called a bail-in. And when you understand how the financial system works, you realize that the banks don't actually hold your money. They lend it out and they spend it. And the other thing is has your money, it's legally theirs. They owe it to you. And if they lose it, that's on you, essentially. It's it's called a bail-in. So there's risks of having your money in a bank, there's risks of having gold, there's risks of having Bitcoin, and there's risks, of everything we can think of. But it's about understanding how to mitigate them as much as possible.
Yeah. And I think what you said, the key is where we're comfortable, where we feel comfortable, finding out this information, understanding it, and then making a decision for yourself, what makes sense for you. And it's not going to be the same for each of us. And that's okay. There's no expectation of that. But if you have at least a basic understanding and you're interested enough to begin protecting yourself, we don't, no one knows the future, we have no idea, but we know enough to know that we should probably be doing something a little bit different. And so I like how your book gives 3 very easy options in a way that any of us can do today, starting today.
Yeah, that's it. And, I make a strong case for all of the 3. And, if people read the book, they'll understand how important gold always is in monetary crises. Everything always resets to gold. So yeah, there's a lot of good things to take from that. But again, to make another comparison, it's kind of like, if somebody realizes and the penny drops that CNN or any mainstream news media is lying to them, the first thing is crisis. Oh no. Where am I going to get my information from? There are so many alternative websites, but I don't know which one to go to. Do I trust this alternative website or that alternative website? Which one? And it's the initial realization is the thing that throws us into chaos, essentially, because all of a sudden we've lost our orientation. We don't know who we are anymore. I used to work for this financial system and now I can't trust it. What do I do? Well, once you understand and accept that process, you actually come to a realization that you can be very, very liberated and very empowered. And if you take your money, for example, out of the banking system and you start putting it into gold, then you feel like a sovereign man or a sovereign woman. You really become your own master and you take control of your life rather than letting somebody else take control of it. And this is what we need to do with our health, with our education, and with our money, everything.
I totally agree. 100%. 100%. Lawrence, we could talk for hours, I think, but we're coming up on the end of our time. So as we wrap up the show today, what's one piece of advice you would leave with the listeners, maybe to start considering about opening their minds so that they can really protect their assets, themselves, and really, you know, as we move forward? And I don't even like to use the word crazy times because that doesn't even cover it, but I think you know what I mean.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. I would say don't be scared of big economic concepts. This is part of the fallacy. People don't understand, you know, these big economic terms that are thrown around by people in finance, and that's deliberate. They want to maintain their pedestal position. But, you know, I've researched this for a year, and these are concepts that anybody can understand when they're broken down. And I realized I was onto something when I started speaking to people that have worked in finance their whole life, and they couldn't answer the questions I was asking, and they didn't know the answer to these really basic things. And it's about just, it's about knowing that you are absolutely capable of understanding how the financial system works. And once you understand it, once you learn how it works, how it's set up against us, how it favors the few, not the many, etc., 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 you then become empowered because now you have a choice. But without that information, you're kind of acting unconsciously. You're acting in the dark. So that's why, you know, tying back to the beginning, information is always ultimately beneficial, even if it temporarily throws us into a bit of a crisis. Even if we don't like it. This is it. Once we overcome that, then we are empowered, and we can move forward and take our sovereignty back. Because at this time, I've never experienced anything where so much of our freedom is trying to be taken away. So it's more important than ever now to be savvy, to be aware, and to take control of things for yourself. Yeah,
very well said. Lawrence, thank you for joining us this week. This has been an amazing conversation. Absolutely loved it.
Absolutely. And it's been great speaking to you.
And congratulations on the success of your book. You've got a lot of great reviews on Amazon. So can you tell the listeners how they can find out more about you and get a copy of your book?
Absolutely. Yeah. So it's available on all online stores. And you can also purchase an audio book via my website. Yeah.
Awesome.
Which is lawrencerook.com. Yeah.
Okay, great. And I'll link to that in the show notes so everybody can find you easier. You've been listening to the Create What You Speak podcast, brought to you by webtalkradio.net. You can also hear the podcast on Spotify, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, and your favorite podcasting player. I'm Sloan Fremont, and I hope you'll join me for the next episode of the Create What You Speak podcast, where we will continue to explore how we can free our minds so we can make the choice to live free in an unfree world. Check out my website, sloanfremont.com, to learn more.